Welcome to BIA Media, Canada's top black media provider. Whether you're looking for content on fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best the black community in Ottawa has to offer and so much more. And better yet, do you have a project you need help with? Well, look no further. We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your way.
All right, everyone, good morning and welcome to week 4 of our course, Early History of the African Renaissance, African History from 1896 to the present. Today is May 27th. We are 2 days away, or 2 days from African Liberation Day. So if anybody was celebrating, and there's going to be a lot of events happening around the world today for African Liberation Day, happy African Liberation Day. Now, I do want to say, there's a lot of confusion going on right now. There is a qualitative difference between African Liberation Day and African Freedom Day. And they're both fall on the same day. And one is actually a co-optation of the other. African Liberation Day was established as African countries were getting independence, first by the OAU and other folks, but then later on by radical revolutionary Pan-Africanists who around the world in the 1970s and 80s, as the struggle against colonialism was fierce, fighting in Zimbabwe, fighting in Angola, fighting in Mozambique, and of course against apartheid South Africa. African Liberation Day was a day for revolutionary Pan-Africanists to get together, to talk about the struggle, to talk about where we're going, and to understand that political independence does not equal liberation. It's a step toward liberation, but they're not one and the same. But African Freedom Day was almost a co-optation of African Liberation Day. It's a day that all the revolutionary character and the critique of colonialism and neo-colonialism and anti-people's policies and all these things that were hurting the African masses, African Freedom Day gets rid of all that rhetoric. African Freedom Day is a celebration of European flags going down and African flags going up. And all of the revolutionary fervor is taken out of the event. So a lot of people celebrate African Freedom Day. The African Union, which has its problems, even AFRICOM, the U.S. military intervention, neo-colonial apparatus that's operating throughout Africa, they put up a thing, African Freedom Day, on their website. That's not African Liberation Day. African Liberation Day is about the African masses fighting against neo-colonialism, the continued fight for liberation. We have 55 countries in Africa. They're all politically independent, but there is no liberation for African people, the masses. We're still fighting for that. We're still fighting for that. So that struggle continues. And I just wanted to make that caveat because a lot of people get those confused. Is African Liberation Day the same day as African Freedom Day? What's the difference? That's the difference. So a lot of revolutionaries are celebrating African Liberation Day and doing political education around the world on that. The Pan-African Congress of Azania, the All-African People's Party, All-African People's Revolutionary Party, the PAIGC in Guinea, the Independent Party of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, they're celebrating it. So many groups. But anyway, let's get into it because the message that we'll get into this week and next week, as we talk about the independence movement, we will talk about how independence didn't lead to liberation. We'll talk about what happened and how the African masses fought for independence, and then what happened once independence was gained. And we get this new class of independence leaders who, in some instances, betrayed the African Revolution, betrayed African liberation for their own gains. But we'll talk about that as we get to it. But today, we're going to deal with a short but powerful piece of literature. Because remember, all of our sessions for this course are going to be dealing with pieces of African literature. Last week, we talked about the novel Batu Allah by Rene Morand and its impact on the New Negro movement, the Harlem Renaissance, its impact on views on French colonialism, so on and so forth. Today we're going to talk about a short article published in 1947 in the Daily Worker, a radical newspaper out of England. It was actually around the world, but it was this one, Daily Worker in particular, was out of England, written by Funmilayo Ransome Kuti. And so we're going to talk about who she was the significance of her article, "We Had Equality Till Britain Came." "We Had Equality Till Britain Came" was the name of this short, it's only 3-page article. We're going to talk about the themes present in this article, and we're going to talk about how networks of African women in particular contributed to the independence movements in the 1940s, 1950s, and going into the 1960s. So this will be our discussion today. Funmilayo Ransome Kuti is one of the most powerful African women activists in the 20th century. And few people know who she is. They know her son, who's very famous, Fela Kuti, the musician, the activist, the anti-government protester, the Pan-Africanist. In many ways, his mother was just as influential as Fela, if not more, because of the time period that she lived in and what she did, and the fact that she influenced him. So we're going to talk about her. We're going to talk about her politics and how she wasn't alone in the struggle in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and these networks of African women all across the world were engaged in this struggle against colonialism and imperialism. All right. So the time period we're talking about, we're moving up through the 20th century. We started in 1896 with the Ethiopian battle, victory at Adwa. We moved and last week, and we talked about the 19 teens and the 20s. We got up to 1925 when Rene Moran, after he had published Batu Allah, and they faced the backlash of the French colonizers. And now we're going to talk about the late 20s, 30s, 40s, and into the 50s today. So we're going to talk about a nice chunk of time between the global depression, the second great European tribal war and its impacts on Africa, and then how Africa responded in the independence movement in the 1940s and 50s. So this is a time period we're moving up. So by the time we get done today, we'll be, halfway through the 20th century. All right, so Funmilayo Ransome Kuti, 1900 to 1978. We're going to be dealing with "We Had Equality Till Britain Came." This article is posted on our course website. If you want to read it in full, it is there. It's only 3 pages. It's a quick read, but it's a powerful read. There's also some articles about her on there as well. So when you go to the website, you'll see week 4, 2023, and this is where all this information that I'm going to be talking about today is. And that is Funmilayo right there with the glasses. Her son looks just like her. So let's talk about the themes in this article. Like I said, this was written in 1947. I'll get back into, actually, let me start here. Let me go back to her background before we get into the themes. She was born in Nigeria, in Abeokuta, Nigeria, southwest Nigeria, Yoruba land. Her family had been Christianized for many generations. Her family Abeokuta was actually a relatively new Yoruba town. It was founded in 1830. Circumstances are people were leaving the war zone that was created through the fall of the Oyo Empire, and they were establishing new towns. And Abeokuta actually means under the rock, because this town was founded near this mountain. So a lot of folks made Abeokuta a very prosperous town. A lot of people that had come from actually Sierra Leone, Yoruba folks that had been captured during the slave trade and were off to the Americas, and those ships were rerouted by the British to Sierra Leone. They ended up coming back to Abeokuta. Other folks established this town. We have talked about Abeokuta in the past because it was the town that Martin Delany and the Jamaican Robert Campbell had come to in order to get land for African Americans in the 1850s. So 20 years after the town was founded, it was already this Pan-African place. This is where she was born. Her family was Christian. She was educated in the Christian school. She was actually one of the few young women that was educated in one of the mission schools in Abeokuta. Her parents even sent her to finishing school in London. Now, it's very interesting. She was born with a Yoruba name, Olufunmilayo, I forget her maiden name. It's not Ransome Kuti is her married name. She was born with a Yoruba name as well as a Christian name. But when she got to London, and this would have been in the early 20th century, she faced incredible amounts of racism at this finishing school. You can imagine being a young black woman from colonial Nigeria in the 19-teens, going to finishing school in London, what that would have been like. So she dropped the Christian name very soon after her experience in London. And this is something that we've seen time and time again with African students making their way to the colonial metropoles, whether it's Paris, whether it's London, where they experience racism for the first time. They experience it and they're like, you know what? I'm abandoning this. Why do I need this quote unquote Christian name, this European name? I'm going to go back to my roots because obviously they don't accept me anyway. So why would I keep this name? So she sticks to her Yoruba name, Olufumilayo, and then she marries another very prominent pastor in Abeokuta, Ransom Kuti. His first name is Israel Ransom Kuti. They would get together and they would have children. One of those children would be Fela Kuti. And her other children were actually medical doctors as well. It's a very prominent family. But when she comes back to Abeokuta, she starts a number of organizations, which we'll get into in a minute, and that activism leads her. By the time we get to 1947, she's a delegate of the newly created party, the NCNC, the National Council for Nigeria and the Cameroons. It's a new political party founded after World War II for Nigerians, because at the time Nigeria and Cameroon were both being administered by the British. They start this political party, and she's the only woman delegate to go to London alongside Nnamdi Azikiwe. Herbert Macaulay is there, but he actually dies early into the trip, and others. And they're there not to press for independence, but to engage in the constitutional debates that are occurring around how the colony is going to be administered after World War II, what it's going to look like. Are Africans going to be given a semblance of self-government? All of that. So that's why they're in London in 1947, and she publishes this article, We Had Equality Till Britain Came, for the British people to understand what's going on in Nigeria as these constitutional debates are happening. So she's the only woman in this delegation, and she's very powerful in this regard. So what is she talking about in this article? Theme number one. The article starts off with a discussion of what Nigeria, or particularly Yoruba land, or Abeokuta in particular, the town that she's from, was like before the British came, particularly for women. Because when she said we had equality, she's talking about African women. And she says this: before the British advent in Nigeria, life there was mainly agricultural, and there was division of labor between men and women. Men cultivated the land and sowed, and it was chiefly the duty of women to reap. Women owned property, traded, exercised considerable political and social influence in society. They were responsible for crowning the kings on coronation days. Whatever disabilities there were endured by both men and women alike. With the advent of British rule, slavery was abolished and Christianity introduced into many parts of the countries, but instead of the women being educated and assisted to live like human beings, their condition has deteriorated. Now, this is a pattern that we see throughout the continent. Now, this isn't to say that before colonialism, Africa was some utopia, some panacea of gender relations and all that. That's not what it's saying. But what we can say is that the political, economic, spiritual, and social condition of African women was much higher before colonialism than during. Because what the British, what the French, what the Germans, what the Belgians, what they brought into Africa was their European understandings of gender relations. Their European understandings that men belong in politics, men belong in the control of economics, and women control the house to a certain extent. This public-private divide. Men are public creatures. They engage in public, economics, politics, these types of things. Women, you're relegated to the home. So when colonization comes, the British, the French, the Belgians, they wanted to put this in place in Africa. So they only would engage politically with men. They only would engage economically as much as they could with men. This was not the case in Abeokuta in southwest Nigeria and Yoruba land before the British were there. So she talks about this. She talks about the lack of educational opportunities for women. She says since the British came, there's only been 4 schools built. 4 schools. And you got to remember, just like today, Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa. 1 in 5 Africans is a Nigerian. There's over probably close to 250 million people in Nigeria right now. Or 200 million people. Not more than 1% of women in Nigeria can read or write. And this is in 1947. Throughout Nigeria, which is 372,674 square miles, there are only 4 secondary schools for girls throughout all of Nigeria, and 3 in Lagos alone, and 1 in the protectorate of Ibadan. The Union of Women, this is the organization she started, which we'll talk about in a minute, has tried to run voluntary schools for adult education, but the women who start work at 4 in the morning are by evening too tired to learn. So she's presenting the fact that, you know, one of the things that colonization liked to pat itself on the back on was that, oh, we built schools throughout Africa. We taught African people. We helped civilize African people. But she's saying, well, even if you did build schools for African women, which are more than half the population, in Nigeria, you only built 4 schools. And 3 of them are in Lagos. So how can you say that you are engaging in this civilizing practice when you're not even allowing the women to go to school? And she's not just saying this to say, we want you to build schools. She said, we tried. The Union of Women, the organization that she started in the 1940s, attempted to use the women like her, because she was a rarity. She was a woman that had education. She was a part of the elite in Abeokuta. Her marriage was unique. Her and her husband, who was a Christian reverend, they had a very equal relationship, which was, you know, very rare for the time. She's actually the first woman in this part of Nigeria to drive a car. You know, very few people had a car, let alone women driving a car. She was one of the few people to drive a car. Her and her husband had this very interesting and equal relationship. And she used that and that freedom that had occurred to her. She started out as a teacher, but then when she got married, she stopped being a teacher, you know, in the schools. But she started these schools for women, the adult women, the market women, so that they can read, so they can understand the contracts, so they can understand the business on that level. So she started these schools, teaching literacy and bringing other women, like her cousin-in-law, or it would be her cousin-in-law. I guess that's how you say it. Her husband's cousin, Grace Shoyinka, who is another famous mother, because her son, Wally Shoyinka, is the Nobel Prize-winning poet and playwright and scholar, Wally Shoyinka. Well, his mother, Grace, was a cousin-in-law of Ransom Kuti, and they formed this organization, the Abeokuta's Union of Women, Women's Union, and they started educating the elite, illiterate women in the community for free. And it was through these educational meetings and these discussions that they really got engaged with the struggle of the market women. And we're going to talk about these strong sisters in a second. The last thing that this article talks about, the third thing that we'll get into, taxation and the exploitation of women. This was the big thing that this article brought out. She said, number one, we had equality before the British came. We had our own political system, economic system, social system, where women were held in high esteem and had political power. Number two, you come in, you say you're going to educate us, you don't even do that. You don't build schools. Women are illiterate, which is, again, retarding their progress economically and socially. And then, on top of all of that, you attempt to tax women and exploit women. She said, taxation of women is unknown in the colony and protectorate of Nigeria, with the singular exception of Abeokuta and Ijebu provinces in western Nigeria. Here, poll tax and income tax are forcefully demanded of women. The method of collecting and assessing taxes is abominable. Young girls are sometimes stripped naked in the street by the men officially designated collectors in order to ascertain whether they are mature enough to pay tax or not. Income tax is assessed arbitrarily. The members of the assessment committee work on commission basis. The more money they're able to collect, the greater their commission. So they relentlessly extort money from those who can ill afford to pay. We talked about this last week in Batu Allah. The Africans that went into the colonial service as policemen and as tax collectors, these were the most hated in the community, because what they did was they extorted the people. And she's talking about this case in Abeokuta, that these brothers that are working for, why don't we even call them brothers, but these black men that are working for the colonial masters are extorting women, forcing them to pay taxes. And since they work on commission, the more people that they can extort, the more money that they get. So this is the situation that's going on in Abeokuta that she's reporting to the British. And she's saying, we want a just system. If we're going to be under colonization, things like this can't happen. And this is in 1947. She's writing about this, but she's not just, lamenting about the situation. She's been actively fighting against these taxes since the 1940s and has been very successful in fighting against these taxes. And the sisters in Abeokuta that are engaged in this struggle against this type of exploitation and taxation, they're not alone. And in fact, they're in a long tradition of Nigerian women that have fought violently against taxation. We can go back to 1929, but this is in Southeast Nigeria. We've talked about this in previous classes. The Women's War, the Igbo Women's War, the Aba War in Southeast Nigeria among Igbo women. Same type of thing. Igbo women before colonization, a tremendous amount of political power. The Igbo political system was a little bit different than the Yoruba system that Ransom Kuti is talking about. The Igbo political system, you had these councils. You had men's councils and women's councils, and they kind of ran society. Well, the women had tremendous control over the market. They controlled the market. If you wanted to do economic business in Igbo land, you're dealing with women. The British come, and then in 1929, right at the height of or at the beginnings of the global depression, they decide that we want to start taxing the economic activities of women. This was a step too far. You're already taxing men. You're doing a head tax, a hut tax on men. Now you want to tax women, and it's the same group of people. You got the Yoruba have a pyramidal political system where you have Obas and Alekes and Onis at the top, and you have different sub-chiefs below, and then you have the people. Among the Igbo at the time, it's not always the case in Igbo history, but at the time, it was a more democratic situation among Igbo land. There were no chiefs. So the British couldn't do what they did in Yoruba land. In Yoruba land, the British took certain chiefs, and they said, you're going to work for us, you're going to get a cut, and you're going to help us collect the tax and so on. Among the Igbo, they didn't have any chiefs to work with. So they made their own chiefs. The British came in and said, we're going to take any of you Africans that are willing, that become Christianized, that say you will work for the British, and we're going to make you a chief. And to show that you're a chief, we're going to give you these red hats, and we're going to put them on your head, these caps. That way everybody will know that you're a warrant chief, and you'll be respected. That's what the British told them. You'll be respected. But what really happened was this. The women started knocking the caps off these brothers. Like, we don't respect, this is something the British gave you, it has no reflection on our culture, take this thing off. And they would knock it off their heads. We're not paying taxes to you. So that's a sign of disrespect. They would knock the caps off their head. They looted factories. They pissed these women off so much that they would dare to tax the activities of women. They started looting factories. They started burning down native court buildings. They started blocking train tracks, cutting telegraph wires, releasing prisoners from colonial jails. They started destroying and confiscating colonial property. These sisters caused such a ruckus that the British were like, all right, we're sorry. We're sorry. We take it back. We're not going to tax the women. And they were like, thank you. And then they went back to their economic activities. But this shows the power, the collective power of African women. Do not mess with their money. You can tax the men, you can do that. You're not going to mess with our economic activities. So this happened in Southeast Nigeria in 1929. So when they attempted to do the same thing in Southwest Nigeria in Abeokuta, the sisters were ready and they responded. I'll talk about what they did in Abeokuta because it actually continues to go after this article was written. The last thing that she writes in the article in 1947, and this is key for her thinking at the time. She says, British people of Britain, particularly women of Britain, your country is responsible for the state of ours. Can you let this state of things continue? Finally, I would like to make it clear that we are neither anti-British nor desire to drive the British from our country, but we are definitely anti-oppression and anti-exploitation. She makes it a point to put that in the article, I think for strategic reasons. The NCNC is organizing for independence, but they can't outright say that or else they'll be crushed by the British. So she has to say this in 1947 as things are getting ready, the independence movement is growing. So she's saying, as we negotiate these new constitutions for how you're going to relate to the Nigerian people, we want this exploitation to stop. And this is what they present in 1947. So what ends up happening is this article, We Had Equality Till Britain Came, this 3-page article makes international news, what she writes. The authorities in Southwest Nigeria try to refute our claims, saying, no, that's not the truth, that's not what's going on, but this is picked up around the world. And she becomes a figure of anti-colonial activism. But this isn't even the most important thing that she does. This is just the one that's written and published. It's really her actions before this article was written, and particularly after, that we should talk about. So, like I mentioned, in 1944, she had started the Abeokuta's Women's Union. That's bringing together the market women, the illiterate women, and the literate women together to talk about women's issues, to teach literacy, and to start politically making the women politically conscious and getting them ready for the rebellion. So she taught literacy, and she organized a revolt against the poll tax that was started in 1946. Prior to 1946, however, the women had another struggle, particularly during the European Tribal War. And she was very influential in this. So, 1939, Britain enters World War II, what I like to call the Second Great European Tribal War. They talk about Africans having tribal wars all the time. They're like, oh, that's a tribal war. World War II is a tribal war. You got the German tribe, you got the French tribe, you got the English tribe, you got the Russian tribe. That's tribalism. The only difference is African tribalism doesn't leave Africa. European tribalism tries to bring the entire world into their tribal fights. Just like you're seeing right now with Ukraine and Russia. That's tribalism. They want to call our stuff tribalism, I call this stuff tribalism. That's tribalism. But anyway, during that tribal war, Nigeria and the British colonies in Africa were sucked into what was going on in Europe. And the British wanted to exploit from their colonies as much as they could. So they had started confiscating food from the market women in Nigeria. They say, we need this rice for the war effort. We need this palm oil for the war effort. And we're going to set price controls. So, normally when you go to the market in Africa, prices are negotiable. You make an offer, the seller makes an offer, and you go back and forth until you get to something everybody agrees on. The British come in and say, no, this is the price for rice. This is the price for palm oil. This is the price for this. This is the price for that. And then on top of that, you have to understand the geography of Nigeria. Geography of Abeokuta. So this is southwest Nigeria. To the west is Benin. Benin was a French colony, and there have been a lot of business conducted between the women in Abeokuta and the cross-border with Benin. Since Benin was a French colony, and France got occupied by Germany, Benin was now off limits to the British because it was technically a German possession at this point. All of France's colonies in Africa became German possessions when France was occupied by the Germans. So Britain says you can't trade with Benin, we're setting price controls, and we're confiscating food for our tribal war efforts. The women revolted. They said, no, we're going to fight against that. And they organized. And they fought against any man that would try to come in to confiscate the food. And they were very successful. And the British had to rescind that policy in Abeokuta. But then in 1946, they wanted to start this taxation thing again, taxing the women's activities. So the women organized and they said, we are not going for this. And they started these mass mobilizations. And they used singing and chanting. And they would humiliate the brothers that were coming to try to collect the taxes. One report says they marched on the colonial offices, and particularly at the time, the leader of Abeokuta, the Eleke, so this is the chief, this is the head chief of the town of Abeokuta, he was considered a pawn of the British. They had him in their back pocket, and he was the main person responsible for collecting the taxes. So you have this chief that is a pawn of the British. The women focused their energies on this guy, and they would march to his palace, and they would demand that he stop being a pawn for the British. Anybody that was working for him, any of the police and the colonial officials, black and white, that were working for the Eleke and collecting these taxes, they received the humiliating tactics of the women. The women would sing songs in Yoruba language, denigrating these men. During one demonstration, and I don't know if this is verified or not, I was just telling my youth in the room about sources being verified. But one woman was supposedly went up to one of these officials and said, "I will cut off your genitals and send them to your mother." These women were not playing. They were not playing. They marched in the tens of thousands, chanting, fighting, non-violent direct action confrontation against these taxes. It got so unruly that the colony, this part of the colony, was ungovernable, to the point that the electorate was forced to vacate the city in 1949. These women did such damage that the traditional ruler had to leave because he no longer had authority. No one would listen to him. So he got in his car that the British had bought for him, and he ran out the city. It was then that the taxation policies was over, and the women won that struggle. But that, again, that wasn't the end of her political activism. So, and this is all organized. She was the head. She had been thrown in jail several times during this revolt, but the women's union would not negotiate. They wouldn't do anything without their leader, who was Ransom Kuti. And all this time, she's raising a family. She's doing all this. She was the undisputed leader of the women in this area. Because of that, like I said, she was in the National Council for Nigeria and Cameroon, the political party. That also included Nnamdi Azikiwe, the father of Nigerian nationalism and a Pan-Africanist who was educated in the States. And she inspired women's movements and organizations throughout Africa. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana would point to her as a mentor for the Ghanaian women's organizations. She would travel throughout the world advocating for women's rights in Africa. She wasn't alone in this regard. At the same time that she's operating in Nigeria, you have, in the French-speaking world, you got African women using their pen, using literature, people like Paulette Nardal, who brought together the folks that would come a generation after René Morin. These were the Leopold Senghors, the Leon Demas, the Negritude movement, the French-speaking Africans that published works based in African culture. So they were inspired by Batu Allah. Paulette Nardal from Martinique, who, just like René Morin, was from Martinique. She's in Paris. She had started a literary salon, a place where young poets and playwrights from black playwrights and poets from America, from Jamaica, from the African colonies, from the West Indies could get together in Paris. They could share ideas. They could influence each other. She brought them together. She started a very prestigious literary journal, the Review of the Black World, which published a lot of these works. Again, I brought these scholars and activists and writers together in one literary space to exchange ideas. So you got these sisters that are moving, that are connecting people around the African world. Leopold Senghor, one of the fathers of Negritude, he had this to say about Paulette Nardal. It is thanks to Paulette Nardal, the Martinican, foundress of Le Revue des Mondes Noirs, in the 30s that I met Alain Locke and Mercer Cook. These are African-American writers. Thanks to the Guyanese, Leon Demas, I met Langston Hughes and County Cullen, met and especially read. It is thus that in the general sense of the word, the Negritude movement, the discovery of black values and the Negro's awareness of the situation was born in the United States of America. Really, it was born with René Morin, who influenced the writers in the U.S., who then influenced and connected with the Africans from Senegal and from Guyana, French Guyana, and from Martinique, who all were a part of this Negritude movement. So very important. And again, sisters are the connecting tissue. This is the New Negro movement with Alain Locke and all this. This is the Harlem Renaissance, the New Negro movement, where these sisters played a key role. But I want to say this about Paulette Nardal before we take our first break, because she's, again, along the same lines of what Funmilayo Ransom Kuti was saying in 1947. The French, as I mentioned last week, they were really good at creating that colonial mentality in African people. So even when they were resisting French oppression, they could not see themselves separate from France. In fact, Paulette Nardal said, one must not commit the error of considering us to be militants in some political party or other. We only felt very strongly the necessity of having the black man re-enter the fellowship of mankind and to rid him of his complexes, at least the Antillean or the West Indian. All of that is very compatible with our very deep attachment to France, our great country. We find the idea of independence for the Antilles stupid. She said we find the idea of independence for Martinique, for French Guyana, Guadalupe, very stupid. So again, some African people at this time weren't willing to go that far to talk about independence. However, when we come back from break, we're going to talk about a couple of women who were completely different from that regard, who wanted independence now, who wanted African freedom, wanted African freedom now. We're going to talk about the Garvey women. We're going to continue talking about Funmilayo Ransome Kuti and her works after we come back from our first break. So we'll stop for Q&A. Daniel, actually, before we go to the break, and I forgot to cue this, Daniel, could you play a little bit of that video so that folks can see the effects of what Funmilayo Ransome Kuti's revolt did to the Alake of Abe Okuta? Just play this for a minute, and then we'll take our first break.
In late 1946, the Alake increased tax rates for women.
And Daniel, make that full
Thousands of
screen.
women marched to the palace to protest these increases. The Alake's only response was that if any woman felt her taxes were too high, she should appeal to him individually. It seemed there was nothing to achieve, so the Abeokuta Women's Union, through their leader, Funmilayo Ransome Kuti, engaging in a tremendous letter-writing effort, outlined the women's grievances to newspapers in Lagos and Abeokuta. A mass movement was organized and they laid down objectives, some of which included 1. Resistance against the poll tax, 2. Resistance against harsh enforcement of sanitation regulations, the payment of water rates, and finally, the removal of the Alake from office.
Well, there's nothing holding you back. What would your thing
Daniel, if
be?
you can make that full screen, make it full screen.
Hey, come here for a second. Closer. Okay, so this might surprise you, but I just found...
The Alake was vigorously criticized since it was considered the personification and symbol of the sole native authority to the detriment of its people's well-being. Although the colonial government was the real source of power, the Abeokuta Women's Union attacked its agents, that is, the sole native authority and the Alake. They challenged the Alake's abuses of food and price controls and its interference in trade and court matters. He was also accused of demanding sex from some women who had left their abusive spouses to take refuge in his palace and charging them for accommodation. In addition, the Abeokuta Women's Union called for representation of women on all bodies that administered Egba affairs by members of the union. The rationale was that since the men had not protected their rights, women's representatives were needed to do so. The anti-tax protest was a long one, with Funmilayo Ransome Kuti at the head leading the women in the struggle. In 1947, Funmilayo Ransome Kuti refused to pay her taxes and she was arrested. At her arraignment, where she pleaded not guilty, thousands of women congregated at the courthouse to demonstrate their support. The next year, she again refused to pay her taxes. She led the Abeokuta Women's Union in laying down plans for a systematic program of mass protest. The first major demonstration was held on November 29 and 30, 1947. Many women took part. As they neared the Alake's palace, Ransome Kuti commanded the marchers to stop, closed her eyes, and told them that all those who were afraid should leave while her eyes were closed. Nobody left. They all maintained vigil, during which they sang abusive songs. In reference to the Aba Women's Riot of 1929, the women were careful to stress the importance of not allowing the authorities to use any excuse to attack them or use violence by making sure no weapon was carried. Many women were jailed but were later released. In January 1948, Ransome Kuti was banned from the palace for insulting the Alake, and the British administration supported it. Administrative attempts to woo away the Abeokuta Women's Union executive from its support of Ransome Kuti failed. They also refused to attend any meeting without their leader. By April 1948, the women were determined to get rid of the Alake and obtain their demands, one of which were included that the Alake be removed from office. They continued their demonstrations and vowed to go on the streets in nudity, a taboo in Abeokuta as of the time. As they got to the palace, they blocked the two main colonial officers, the resident and district officer, from leaving the palace. As they protested, they sang abusive songs in Yoruba. To gain time, Vialake decided to go for a holiday at the beginning of June in Jos, hoping things would cool off in his absence. He appointed a special committee to investigate the complaints of the women. He also suspended their taxation and agreed to women representatives on the Central Committee. Alas, the women were no longer interested in anything he did. They were only interested in his abdication, so they continued their demonstrations. After he returned, Vialake ceded further ground by resigning his position as head of the sole native authority, but the women would not budge and blatantly refused to accept nothing less than his total abdication and continued their protests. In July, the Egba chiefs and members of the Egba Native Authority passed a resolution against the sole native authority system. They also charged Vialake with corruption and abuse of power. They then rejected him as king, rang the bell, and beat the traditional drums to seal the decision. Finally, on January 3, 1949, Vialake abdicated. The women's protest, which had intensified from October 1946 to July 1948, had been successful. 4 women, all executives of the Abeokuta Women's Union, including Funmilayo Ransome Kuti, were appointed to the Egba Central Council that replaced the sole native authority, and the women taxation was also abolished.
This
thanks,
is
Dan.
not just
Thanks.
a deck of cards.
All right, so you can, and I'll put the link to that video in full on the website if you want to watch it in full, but just wanted to give you a visual representation of what was going on. So we'll open it up to questions. Mr. Francis, go ahead. And Mr. Francis, if you're talking, you're on mute. I'm not sure if he can.
Can you hear me now, sir?
Yes, now, yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I am particularly delighted to hear about these badass African women.
Yes.
And I have one question. How have they been, how have today's black women been more or less diminished in the fiercity of their conviction and militancy? Is this a result of, say, American feminism?
I wouldn't say they've been diminished because, in fact, in recent years, I would say it's the brothers that need to step up. I mean, when we look around the continent, Sudan, for instance, it was the women that kind of kickstarted that revolution in Sudan. In Nigeria today, you have the anti-SARS movement. There's a police force in Nigeria called the Special Armed Robbery Squadron or something like that. But essentially, they commit all types of abuses against people, young people in particular in Nigeria. And it was the women that stood up and protested against it. There's one sister whose name is Aisha. Oh God, her name's escaping me. But it's a sister that's one of the leading voices for that. It was the sisters in South Africa that were doing a lot of the organizing around the anti-Rhodes Must Fall movement and the Fees Must Fall movement. So the sisters actually doing the thing. Even the Black Lives Matter movement in the States, a lot of that organizing and stuff was done by sisters. We don't got to look too far in Ottawa. When we look at the Ottawa Black Diaspora Coalition, when we look at the Abdi, the protest around the killing of Abdi, Abdul Rahman in Ottawa. A lot of that organizing was done by sisters. So I would say that that tradition continues. It definitely continues. And in Brazil, we see this. So yeah, I would say that in terms of the effect of American feminism, that is interesting, but that in itself has also been critiqued by black women who looked at the American feminist movement and they said, as it was presented by mainstream feminists, it wasn't representative of the fights and struggles of black women. So you got a lot of black women critiquing that movement as well through articulations of feminism or womanism and black feminism, which is different from mainstream American white feminism. So you have that as well. But that's A good question. That tradition is strong and it continues. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for enlightening me, and I really am admiring the bravery of these women. I hope it will continue.
That's it. Yes, sir. Mr. Thomas, go ahead.
Morning all. What is meant by Pan-Africanism and what is its significance, if any?
So we're going to talk about this in a second, but Pan-Africanism is both a movement and an objective. So when we talk about Pan-Africanism, it's the idea that African people around the world, whether in the Caribbean, whether they're in the Americas, whether they're on the continent or wherever they are connected and struggle against imperialism, against colonialism, against anti-black racism and discrimination, those types of things. As we'll talk about in our second segment, it was a movement started in the early 1900s that brought African people together through various meetings and conferences. But then after independence started to come, Pan-Africanism then became an objective. It became the objective articulated by particularly Kwame Nkrumah that Africa should be united and liberated under a socialist government. That became the objective of Pan-Africanism, African liberation and unification under scientific socialism. So it's both that objective as well as the movement that led to that objective, is what Pan-Africanism is. David H., go ahead.
Thank you. I was wondering, when the schools were created, what language were they teaching and what cultural experiences were considered higher education? Would that be that of the European or that of the traditional African content?
Oh, of course it's a European. Of course. I mean, well, it depends on what schools you're discussing. If we're talking about the colonial schools, these are, they were created by Europeans essentially to create, particularly in places where there wasn't settler colonialism. So we're not talking about Kenya and South Africa, but in places like Nigeria and Ghana and Congo and Tanzania, these were areas where there weren't a lot of Europeans physically on the ground. So they needed to create a class of Africans that would be more loyal to Europe and European ideas, who could do things like run the taxation, run the forced labor camps, run the colonial administration in place of the Europeans, so that Europe would still continue, the European power would still continue to reap the benefits of African raw materials and African labor, but they would have an African class who would be the bureaucracy. So that's what these schools were created for. And then you had the mission schools that were really just designed to get Africans familiar with the Bible, learn the European language, so that way they can convince other Africans to convert to Christianity. Sooner, though, Africans who went through these schools, some of them decided to start their own schools that did have a more African flavor to the education, but was still based on that European model. But then you also had the completely independent schools, like what was set up by the Abeokuta's Women's Union, that combined the European literacy as well as teaching Yoruba values, Yoruba language, and that type of thing. So you had both.
Thank you.
And I think, as I see another hand, anything in the chat, Daniel?
No, there's nothing in the chat.
All right, so let's get back. Robin, did you have something? Okay. All right, let's get back into it. So we're in the 1930s, 1940s. And some of the activists are advocating for a better version of colonialism, a colonialism in which Africans have some say, that type of thing. This is Paulette Nardal. This is Funmilayo Ransome Kuti's articulation in 1947. And then you have these radical African women that are saying, independence now, African freedom now. There have probably been, on an international level, no two women more significant to the African Freedom Project than Amy Ashwood Garvey and Amy Jacques Garvey. They're not sisters. They were both married to Marcus Garvey. We won't get into the details of that. You can you can take our She Rose classes to get into all the details about that. But Amy Ashwood is the first wife. Amy Jacques Garvey is the second wife. And both of these women were incredibly influential throughout the African world. Amy Ashwood Garvey, if you want to read about them, you can read about Amy Jacques Garvey in The Veiled Garvey, The Life and Times of Amy Jacques Garvey by Ula Taylor, as well as Set the World on Fire, which by Keisha Blaine, which deals with a number of women in the Garvey movement, not just them, but also women like Louise Little, Queen Mother Moore, and others. So Marcus Garvey, as we've talked about in previous classes, was a Jamaican who had got influence to start an organization for African freedom while he was on a steamship coming from London, and he heard about what was going on in South Africa. When he gets back to Jamaica in 1914, he starts advocating for a worldwide African organization. He's also influenced by another Jamaican who's part of the Pan-African movement named Robert Love, but we'll talk about that another time. But when he goes back to Jamaica in 1914, he meets a woman named Amy Ashwood. And Amy Ashwood becomes his first wife. And together, so Amy Ashwood and Marcus Garvey, because a lot of people say that Garvey's organization, the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Community Leagues, or the UNIA-ACL, was founded by Marcus Garvey. That's partially correct. Marcus Garvey and Amy Ashwood Garvey were the co-founders of the largest organization that black people have ever created. Say that again. The largest organization that black people ever created. Started in Kingston, Jamaica with a handful of people in 1914. By the time we get to 1921, they're able to put 25,000 people in Madison Square Garden in Harlem, New York. This is an organization with 500 chapters around the world, present in 22 countries, close to 6 million Africans as members in the 1920s. 6 million Africans. Africans in Montreal, Africans in Brazil, Africans in Trinidad, Jamaica, Haiti, South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, Paris, London. Africans all over the world in this one organization, founded by Amy Ashwood Garvey and Marcus Garvey. Organization was arguing for a complete independence of Africa. Not partial independence, not a better form of colonialism, complete independence. Africa for the Africans, at home and abroad was the slogan. Europe for the Europeans, Asia for the Asians, Africa for the Africans, at home and abroad. During the parade of the UNIA, because the UNIA really blows up when Garvey comes to Harlem. Garvey's in this car, and the sign on this car tells everything you need to know about the organization. The new Negro has no fear, is what it says on that car. The placard that's being held up in that car that Garvey is in. The new Negro has these fears. They weren't fearful. You see the sisters here that were the Black Star nurses, as well as in their own paramilitary organization. You had the brothers, the Black Legion, Garvey's paramilitary force. So you can imagine being in Harlem, New York. And again, Harlem was home to Africans, not just from the United States, but Africans from the West Indies, African students studying from the continent that were in Harlem at the time. And they're seeing this parade, and this is making international news in his newspaper, The Negro World, which was eventually edited and put out by his second wife, Amy Jacques Garvey, the most widely read black newspaper of all time. The Negro World went all over the world. It's the 1920s. So there's no social media, there's no television. Radio only goes to a certain extent. This was the way black people communicated with each other on these big, grand ideas about the Negro world. So you can imagine these images and the rhetoric that Garvey is saying. Garvey would say things like, if they lynch a black man in Alabama, we should be able to push a button and kill a white man in Africa. This is the type of things that Garvey is saying in the 1920s. This attracted people like Earl and Louise Little, who become the parents of Malcolm X. It attracted people like a young Nnamdi Azikiwe, who's reading about Garvey in Nigeria, hears about this. And people in Africa are convinced that Garvey is going to lead this army out of America to come to Africa to end colonization. This is how dangerous Garvey's reputation was growing in Africa. And the colonizers knew this. The French, the English, the Belgians, they did everything they could to keep Garvey's newspaper and Garvey's organization out of Africa because it was inspiring black people so much. And a lot of this was the work done by the women in the organization. Amy Ashwood Garvey, When her and Marcus Garvey get a divorce in 1923, 22 or 23, she doesn't stop the movement. She continues. She moves to London and continues the movement. His second wife becomes very influential in the movement. And when Garvey gets arrested, she basically takes over the organization while he's locked up. So Amy Jacques Garvey is running the organization. Amy Ashwood Garvey, the first wife, is still organizing for African freedom abroad, and they're influencing African women and men all over the world. Amy Jacques Garvey publishes a column every week in the Negro World called Our Women and What They Think, where she argues for African women to stand up, to take control over the freedom struggle. Again, you see the Black Cross nurses. They had the Red Cross nurses. Garvey had the Black Cross nurses. And you see them there. Garvey's influence. Branches were established in Sierra Leone, Liberia, Senegal, Nigeria, Namibia, South Africa, Gold Coast, which becomes Ghana, Cameroon, and Zambia. Like I mentioned, black people all over the world had this rumor going that Garvey's army was going to come and liberate Africa. And he was feared by all these colonial powers. Kwame Nkrumah, the father of radical Pan-Africanism, the first president of Ghana, he writes, when he was a student in the United States, studying at Lincoln University, my alma mater in Pennsylvania, first historically black college. Nkrumah says, of all the literature that I studied, the book that did more than any to fire my enthusiasm was The Philosophies and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, published by his wife. Amy Jacques Garvey took all of Marcus Garvey's speeches, his writings, his articles. She put them in one book called The Philosophies and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, one of the most influential books in African world history, published by his wife, because he was locked up at the time. She put all this together, went around the world, and it sparked African freedom. So all of this is happening based off the work of these African women. Amy Ashwood, I see. Amy Ashwood Garvey, after she splits from Marcus Garvey, I see her, moves to London. When she gets to London, she establishes a restaurant and a social parlor, very similar to what Paulette Nardal did in Paris, bringing together African intellectuals, African students to talk about African freedom. She organized in 1925 the West African Student Union alongside a brother from Liberia, actually, not from Liberia, from Nigeria, named Oladipo Solanke, who was very close with Funmilayo Ransome Kuti and her husband, Israel Ransome Kuti. So all of this is connected. In fact, the West African Student Union that Amy Ashwood Garvey helped establish in London, Funmilayo Ransome Kuti becomes a member, and an active member. So you have this woman from Jamaica who is organizing in London and is connected with the Nigerian students who connect her with Funmilayo Ransome Kuti. In fact, when Amy Ashwood Garvey, she's the only Garvey to go to Africa. Marcus Garvey never steps foot in Africa because of the fear the colonizers had of him. He never steps foot in Africa. He dies in 1940. Amy Ashwood Garvey is the only Garvey to go to Africa. And when she does, one of the places that she goes, Abeokuta. She gives a speech at Abeokuta, and she's welcomed in Abeokuta by Funmilayo Ransome Kuti and others that were in the Abeokuta's Women's Union. They bring Mrs. Garvey there, and I think she goes to Nigeria in 1949, actually not long after the tax revolt. She's there. She organizes the International African Friends of Ethiopia, because in 1935, the Italians invade Ethiopia. This is really when Africans get involved in World War II. And this organization included people like the African students that she was working with in WASU, in the West African Student Union, included people like the great Paul Robeson, who I keep saying we need to have a seminar on. I think that's going to be September's seminar, because I keep saying it and I haven't done it yet. In September, we're going to do an entire 3-week seminar just on this man, on Paul Robeson. So stay tuned for that. Included people like Claudia Jones, the Trinidadian woman radical, Claudia Jones, and others. So Amy Ashwood Garvey is putting all these people together. And what they decided to do was, when Ethiopia was invaded by the Italians, it became a political organization to fight against Italian aggression in Ethiopia, diplomatically, to pressure the British and the French to live up to the League of Nations mandate. You have to go back a little bit. After the great European tribal war, the first one, they created something called the League of Nations. They said, we don't ever want another big war to break out again. So we'll have this organization where countries can get together and talk out their problems so they don't have to go to war. One of those member states was Ethiopia. It was the only independent country in Africa. So it joined the League of Nations. But when one of the other members, Italy, invaded Ethiopia, the emperor at the time, Haile Selassie, said, hey, League of Nations, we're all supposed to be talking things out. You're supposed to stop people from aggressing. What's going on? They didn't come to his aid. Why would the Europeans come to the aid of an African country? He should have known that, but of course, he took the Europeans at their word. So the Africans had to step up. If Europe wasn't going to defend Ethiopia, Africans abroad were going to defend Ethiopia. Because remember how this class starts. In 1896, when the Ethiopians defeat the Italians, it makes international African news. Ethiopia is the symbol of African freedom. So to have that symbol invaded, and as violently invaded as it was, Africans around the world rose up. You had lines around the block in Harlem of African men signing up to fight in Ethiopia. You had Colonel Johnny C. Robinson come from the United States and help fund help to found Ethiopia's Air Force. He's one of the first black pilots in the U.S., built his own plane, so on and so forth. So you had Africans all over the world ready to come to the aid of Ethiopia. As I mentioned, the woman in this, to the right of Paul Robeson, Claudia Jones, another one of these women radicals at the time that was fighting for African freedom. She was originally from Trinidad. She had grown up in New York. She had seen the conditions of African working women in New York. She actually developed tuberculosis from the factories and things that she worked on. She dies at an early age, in her 40s. But she also becomes an organizer. She becomes a member of the Communist Party in the United States and the International Communist Party. And she writes about the role of black women in struggle. And she says, in one of her articles, the end of the neglect of the problems of Negro women in 1949, again, the same year that the tax revolt was successful. The bourgeoisie, or the capitalist class, the exploited class, is fearful of the militancy of the Negro woman, and for good reason. The capitalists know far better than many progressives seem to know that once Negro women undertake action, the militancy of the whole Negro people, and thus of the anti-imperialist coalition, is greatly enhanced. This is the type of work that Claudia Jones is putting out. Claudia Jones will be exiled from the United States for her communist activity, for her organizing of black women and black men and even working class white folks. She would go to London and she would start the carnival. Everybody knows, familiar with the carnival in Brixton and among black London people. She's the originator of that. But also in London, she was engaged in these revolutionary politics as well. So you see her, you see Paul Robeson, you see Amy Ashwood Garvey. So she's an organizer. She's bringing all of these people together. While at the same time in Ethiopia, because again, today's section is about these women, as Mr. Francis said, these badass women. I love it. Anytime I get to show this picture in class is a good day for me. Because these are the type of women that were fighting against the Italians on the ground in Ethiopia, led by Shiragret Gedle. Gedle was captured, escaped, fought against the Italians, fought against them in the capital of Ethiopia, organized people, raised money to fight against them, and you see her with her horse, her fro, her gun. I have the question mark there because I'm not sure when she died, but she didn't die during the battle. She must have died later on. After she survived the occupation of Ethiopia and fought against the Italians. I'm just not sure the exact date that she died, so don't think that she's still alive. But I don't know, as badass as she was, she might still be around, I don't know. But this is the type of resistance that the Italians faced in Ethiopia. Women such as this. And again, she's a representative of that fighting spirit of African women all over the continent at the time that were ready to put an end to imperialism and colonialism. So by the time we get to 1945, Amy Ashwood Garvey, the other Pan-Africanists, people like students like Kwame Nkrumah, who had left the United States, is now in London. People like the great W.E.B. Du Bois, who had taken up the mantle of the Pan-African conferences, who was actually a rival of Garvey, who had established these Pan-African congresses following the one that we talked about in 1900, the Pan-African Conference, which was organized by Henry Sylvester Williams and the Haitian Benito Sylvan and others. 1919, you had one, 1921, 23, 27, and these Congresses were, again, they were talking about a more benign colonialism. We just want to be treated better under colonialism. By the time we get to 1945, however, that's not the talk anymore. The talk is independence now, we want to be free. We've seen your tribal war where the Germans did their number on the British and the French. Europe was weak at the time. Africans say, this is our shot. This is our shot to get free. This is our shot to demand independence, not a better form of colonialism, independence now. And the first panel that they had was chaired by Amy Ashwood Garvey. And to get the proceedings started at this Pan-African Congress in Manchester, 1945, one of the most important meetings of African people, a meeting that included Jomo Kenyatta, who became the first president of Kenya, Kwame Nkrumah, like I mentioned, who became the first president of Ghana, other independence leaders and fighters from all over the continent. This is the first Congress that actually had more Africans from the continent than Africans from the diaspora. And you can see the tone of the conference was different. They were talking about workers' rights. And Amy Ashwood started the Congress by saying, as we deliberate, as we plan to get the Europeans out of Africa, do not forget African women. Because most of the people in this room were men. She said, do not forget African women. They have struggled side by side with you against imperialism, for independence. Do not forget them in their struggles. That was her message to the collective. So people like Nkrumah would leave this Congress and they would go back to their countries and they would organize. They would organize among the young people. They would organize among the women, the market women. They would organize among the returning soldiers that had fought for the British and the French in their tribal wars, who were coming back to their colonies and they're looking like, I just got done shooting Japanese people in Burma. I just got done fighting against Germans in continental Europe. And I'm going to come back to my colony and be exploited by you? No. This is the same thing that's happened in the United States, too. African American men are coming back from World War II, and they're like, we just got done shooting Germans and Japanese, and there you want us to get lynched? No, we're fighting back. So you had underground movements like the Deacons for Defense that emerged in the 50s and 60s in the United States. The civil rights movement would emerge, all at the same time of the independence movements in Africa. All this is connected. So Nkrumah goes back after the Pan-African Congress, and he begins to try to liberate the Gold Coast, Ghana. And he's successful by the time we get to 1957. And one of the people that helps him in that success is a sister by the name of Hannah Kojo. Hannah Kojo joined the first political party in Ghana, the United Gold Coast Convention in 1948. But then when that organization, which Nkrumah was in, starts to show itself to be very go slow, kind of, let's, just negotiate with the British and got to get a better form of colonialism, she splits with Nkrumah to start the Convention People's Party, the radical movement of the youth and the women and the anti-imperialist intellectuals like Nkrumah. And they're the ones that organize the people that are going to move society forward, the women, the youth, the radicals. And when they do, they're able to successfully lead Ghana to independence. In 1957, Ghana gets independence through the efforts of these women represented by Hannah Kojo and others. She becomes the national propaganda secretary for the party. So all the party's materials, its T-shirts, its posters, all this, she's responsible for all of that. Getting the message out about independence now. And not just independence for Ghana, but independence for all of Africa, because that's what Nkrumah was about. Nkrumah had studied Garvey. He had been a student of George Padmore and W.E.B. Du Bois and Amy Jacques Garvey, Amy Ashwood Garvey. He was a student of Funmilayo Ransome Kuti, who inspired him to empower women I won't say empower, but to make sure as a man, as a leader of a political party, that he did not neglect the women. He learned that from women like Amy Ashwood Garvey, women like Funmilayo Ransome Kuti, who he talks about as giving him the inspiration to help start the Ghanaian Women's Union, which Hannah Kojo was a part. So you have all of this going on in the 1950s, and other countries would start to get free and independence, and the women would play such a key role in this. But what we'll talk about next week is what happens once independence comes. Because like I started this class by saying, there's a difference between independence and liberation. They're not one and the same. Political independence is just one flag going down, another flag going up. But unless you fundamentally change society and you truly focus on the working class and women and the youth, liberation is fleeting. So we're going to talk about next week what happened in the years following political independence. And we're going to focus on two pieces of work. We'll start by talking about the Battle of Algiers, which talks about struggles a little bit different than Nigeria and Ghana. Struggles in which European settlers had come to countries and they were determined to stay, and the fights that had to occur to get them out. This book also talks about what needed to be done to rehabilitate a country coming out of colonialism and how to get further steps toward liberation after political independence, because political independence is just the first step toward true liberation. The second piece that we will consider, and this movie, if you want to watch it before class, is on our course website. It's on YouTube. So just type in the Battle of Algiers. You can watch it in French. You can watch it in English. The second piece that we will consider is the novel The Man of the People by Chinua Achebe, which talks about the leaders of independent African countries, the newly independent African countries, the choice that they had to make, how they navigated the internal politics of a newly independent country, as well as dealing with the external, and how some people decided that this would be a perfect time to enrich themselves. So we'll talk about those two pieces of African literature that will take us through the 50s, late 50s, and into the late 60s next class. So go to the course website, watch this film. You can read the book. I'll see if I put a link up to the book, and that will be our discussion for next week. So let's stop there for today and open it up to any questions, announcements, or anything like that. Daniel, any hands or anything in the chat?
Yes, there is a question in the chat. Somebody asked, is there a book now that you believe has an equivalent level of influence as Marcus Garvey's book had at the time?
It's a good question. That's a really good question. You know, the sad thing is people don't read as much as they used to. So I'm trying to think of something that came out contemporary that I don't think anything is, to answer the short answer to that question is no. I don't think there's anything that's had that much of an impact as that. I would say since this book was published in the 20s, I would say since then, I would say Wretched of the Earth comes very close. Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, published in 64, 65. In terms of its impact, comes close. Possibly something like that.